The metallic groan of the rust bucket's magnetic grapples fighting for purchase against a superstructure of fused, derelict engine blocks was the loudest sound in the sector, which meant it was far too loud. A cold knot tightened behind Kalen's sternum, a familiar physical manifestation of crossing a boundary that the hegemony defined with lethal intent. He ignored the tremor in his left hand, focusing instead on the primary monitor where the anomaly pulsed, deep within the forbidden acreage of Verlassung-3. Forbidden meant valuable, or more precisely, deadly if discovered. His entire existence, cataloging the debris of forgotten conquests, was predicated on skirting the invisible lines drawn by the ethel. He killed the main thrusters. The transition from kinetic maneuvering to dead drift was jarring. The ship settled into the metallic currents of the debris field with a sound like a dying whale sighing. Outside the reinforced viewport, the usual haze of ionized particulate matter had thinned, replaced by an oppressive vacuum of visual noise. Endless, twisted wreckage that spoke of catastrophic failure on a scale Kalen preferred not to calculate. The air recyclers in his small cockpit were straining against the pervasive chill that seeped through the hull plating, carrying the faint, sharp scent of supercooled metal and ancient inert dust. The deep scanner reading was the key. Not energy, not mass, but a rhythmic, almost biological oscillation buried beneath layers of gravitational distortion. It was positioned precisely where ethel reconnaissance reports indicated a localized spatial instability, a polite term for a zone too dangerous or too secret to touch. Kalen punched in a minimal power sequence, diverting reserves from life support to the forward floodlights. The rust bucket's artificial sun cut through the gloom, illuminating colossal, rusted spars that might have once been sections of a capital ship's spine, now bent into impossible geometries. Then, the silhouette resolved through a gap in the wreckage. It defied geometry. It did not reflect light so much as it seemed to consume it, appearing as a three-dimensional hole punched in the fabric of space. It was vast, the kind of scale that made a spacer feel less like an explorer and more like a bacterium under a microscope. The smooth continuity of its surface suggested fabrication on a scale that transcended welding or plating. It looked organic, a colossal dark seed adrift in a field of broken things. Kalen felt a physical pressure, not gravitational but auditory. A low, subsonic thrumming that bypassed his ears and vibrated against his teeth. It was the sound of immense latent power, perfectly contained. He maneuvered the rust bucket to within a few hundred meters, the automated proximity alarm shrieking against the unnerving quiet. He cycled the external sensors, searching for weapon signatures, energy emissions, anything conventional. Negative. The barrier surrounding the object was absolute negation, a null field that swallowed sensor sweeps whole. His immediate concern was not the mythic reputation, but the sheer logistical impossibility of its existence in this sector. If ethel patrols found him here, the charges would range from unauthorized salvage in a restricted zone to high treason. He needed confirmation of what this thing was before retreating. He initiated the remote probe deployment, a standard manipulator arm equipped with spectral analyzers. As the arm extended, whining faintly with the effort, it reached the invisible boundary. The arm did not buckle, did not melt. It simply stopped, frozen mid-extension, its visual feed showing an opaque charcoal surface inches away. The onboard diagnostics reported extreme kinetic resistance, as if touching a mountain of solidified inertia. Kalen leaned back against the worn webbing of his command chair, the familiar scent of old lubricant and stressed circuitry filling his nostrils. This was not a hoax. This was ancient, and it was real. He thought of Eris Northwick, back on the fringe colony where he'd spent his youth, an engineer who dared to suggest that humanity's restricted technology wasn't an accident, but purposeful limitation imposed by the hegemony. She'd been disappeared by hegemony security for sedition against technological stability 5 years ago. He carried that failure like ballast. The reason he kept pushing the envelope in Verlassung-3, looking for a leverage point, a truth that could justify the systematic subjugation of his species. He initiated the secure quantum link to Lyra. Her feed snapped onto a secondary screen, her sharp features framed by the stark white of her data bunker walls. She was already reviewing the data burst, the faint emerald luminescence of the hull markings. "Kalen, what in the void have you found?" Lyra's voice, usually modulated and cool, carried an edge of genuine alarm. The scent of burnt polymer, indicative of stressed processing units in her bunker, seemed to cross the void between them. "It's too quiet, Lyra. It doesn't belong here. The signature is too clean for debris, too stable for a natural anomaly. I'm locked out by something I can't even measure." Lyra's fingers flew across her holographic interface. The Viridian lore is thin, fragmented, almost ritualistic in the restricted ethel databanks. They weren't warships, Kalen. They were vessels of preservation. The Xylos, they were called. They engineered life on a galactic scale, then archived it when environmental collapse became inevitable. The hegemony didn't just contain them. They quarantined the relics because they represented an alternative timeline, a seed of power they couldn't control or replicate. She paused, zooming in on the glowing runes. They are not instructions. They are checksums. A lock based on universal constants. Kalen watched the glowing script cycle. He remembered the basic mathematical principles taught in the subsidized human educational modules. Principles the hegemony insisted were the peak of multi-species comprehension. He started inputting a prime sequence he'd once used to bypass an old freight lock, a sequence that held significance in several pre-hegemony mathematics texts. The result was immediate. Not an explosion, not a surge, but a precise molecular shift. A seam opened on the dark hull, silent and utterly smooth, like a petal unfurling in vacuum. The interior light spilled out, not white or electrical, but a soft internal green, photosynthetic perhaps. The oppressive silence lifted slightly, replaced by that deep, resonant hum, now stronger, pulling at Kalen's very core. He piloted the rust bucket through the aperture, guiding it into a docking bay that formed instantly around his hull. The airlock hissed open, cycling something that smelled clean, damp, and utterly alien, the scent of life preserved beyond comprehension, mingling with the stale industrial stench clinging to his own vessel. The interior was a vast, vaulted space, a gallery of suspended wonders. Massive, crystalline spheres drifted in fields of softly glowing amber light. Inside them, entire biomes were held captive, not models, but actual tangible collections of flora and fauna from worlds dead for millennia. Kalen saw towering segmented trees, shimmering winged insects frozen mid-flight, and entire oceans encapsulated in shimmering fluid. It was a library built of living history. The dying hum was the key. He found the core chamber. It was a nexus of crystalline structures woven around a central light source, weak and sputtering like an ember clinging to existence. Lyra's frantic data stream overlaid his vision. The Xylos required immense uninterrupted energy to maintain the stasis fields. The ship was running on fumes, its final act of preservation failing. To save even a fraction, he would need to tap the main power conduit routed to sector capital Nomara, the hegemony's central hub. A disruption there would be immediately flagged as strategic warfare. Rowan Kestrel, a scrap salvager who barely received minimal sanitation access, initiating a power fluctuation that could provoke a full-scale planetary cleansing against the human sectors. His own kind would pay the full price for his fleeting moment of transcendental discovery. He stood before the dying light, the weight of species against species settling onto his shoulders. It was not about heroism. It was about triage under impossible duress. He could not save the library, but perhaps he could send a single page back into circulation. He retreated to the rust bucket, his movements heavy. He did not attempt the main siphon. Instead, he located a vulnerable tertiary relay station servicing a low-priority ethel orbital platform, a calculated risk. He clamped two heavy-duty, jury-rigged capacitors onto the relay's access port, initiating a controlled temporary shunt. The resulting power draw was minor enough to register as a systemic brownout, perhaps blamed on aging infrastructure, but severe enough to send a significant jolt into the Viridian core. A surge of energy flooded the chamber behind him. The deep hum rose in pitch, stabilizing, then falling back into a steady, powerful rhythm. Kalen watched the nearest pods, 3 containing vibrant, deep purple mosses and small, crystalline ground dwellers, brighten. He quickly initiated the data extraction, packaging the genetic profiles of those few surviving samples, and launched the packet anonymously into the nearest uncontrolled transit lane, a whisper against the hegemony's roar. When he sealed the manipulator arm and pulled away, the great dark seed resumed its slow, patient thrumming, a monumental ghost momentarily sustained. He broke orbit, plunging the rust bucket back into the chaotic magnetic fields of the scrap heap. He was Kalen the scavenger, but he carried the secret of the xylos, and the crushing knowledge that the preservation of profound beauty sometimes required the immediate sacrifice of self-preservation, a choice he now had to live with. Knowing the ethel surveillance nets would already be tightening around the faint signature of that tertiary power drain. He had stolen a fraction of life, and in doing so, he had painted a target on every human world within 3 sectors. The rust bucket shuddered violently, not from external impact, but from the strain of the power transfer collapsing. Kalen slammed his open palm onto the emergency disconnect, severing the jury-rigged connection to the tertiary relay with a shower of angry blue sparks that briefly illuminated the grime coating his control panel. The air in the cockpit, moments ago smelling faintly of ozone and alien chlorophyll, was now acrid with burnt insulation and the metallic stink of overworked relays. The silence that followed the electrical snap was not the spiritual quiet of the Viridian vessel, but the harsh, tense quiet of a small ship running on fumes and prayer. He brought the main drive back online, slowly, cautiously, fighting the urge to jump to maximum burn. A sudden, massive power surge in that sector, even a localized one, would trigger an automated ethel response protocol within 40 standard minutes. 40 minutes to put 1,000 kilometers of useless drifting metal between himself and the hegemony's reaction fleet. Kalen reached for the ration pack, his fingers slick with cold sweat, and fumbled the nutrient bar. The deliberate action of feeding himself was an attempt to reassert physical control, to anchor himself against the psychic weight of his decision. He saw, behind his eyelids, the faint, incandescent green of the moss samples he had managed to save. A victory measured in microns of preserved biomass against the looming threat of planetary annihilation. The irony was a constant, abrasive companion. He had defied the ultimate law, the preservation of the status quo, to save something ancient and beautiful, and in doing so, he had guaranteed that the immediate future of his own people would be defined by damage control, paranoia, and systemic retribution. The comms panel spat static, then resolved into a tight, encrypted signal. Lyra. Her face was pale, her bunker lights dimmed to emergency amber. Kalen, that wasn't a glitch. That was a signature spike. Textbook pattern recognition failure on their end. But the spike was too sharp for simple infrastructural decay. The Ethel Intelligence Corps flagged it immediately. They are rerouting patrol sweeps to Verlasung Dry's deep salvage perimeter. How long? Kalen's voice was a dry rasp. Less than 30 minutes before an aerial survey drone enters scanning range of the Viridian signature. They are treating it as a containment breach, not just a power fluctuation. They know something impossible is there. They are scared. Fear, Kalen knew, was the hegemony's most effective weapon. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, and most recently, fear of human ambition rising above acceptable baseline parameters. Rowan Kestrel, the rogue salvager who barely held sanitation access on a dusty moon, had just tripped their master alarm. Did the data get out? He pressed. Yes, it's already propagating through the gray channels. Anonymous attribution. They'll never trace it back to a physical source in time. But that is irrelevant now. You need to leave that system entirely, Kalen. Now. Kalen looked back at the aft monitors, tracking the position of the monolithic seed ship. He could feel the residual thrumming against his spine, the ghost of the Xylo's dying breath. He could not leave it. He had glimpsed something that redefined existence, something that rendered the hegemony's petty dominance over trade routes meaningless. He felt a visceral, almost painful obligation to protect the single fragile connection he had forged. Negative, Lyra. I have to stabilize it. If they find that ship intact, they will dissect it, weaponize what they can, and erase the rest. They will sanitize the knowledge. That moss sample, it's only the echo of what's inside. I need to ensure that if they find the hull, they find a dead system, not a live ark. Lyra stared at him, her expression shifting from professional urgency to something colder, a grim resignation. You are risking sector-wide human retaliation for a dead civilization's garden. Kalen, the hegemony doesn't negotiate over containment breaches. They execute policy. They will sweep the entire system clear. Humans caught in the crossfire won't even register as collateral damage. They'll be categorized as contaminated variables. That was the core injustice. Humanity was treated as a virus, kept on the fringes, tolerated only when scraping the grime off the hegemony's grand machine. Eris Northwick had known it. She had understood that true freedom wasn't about asking for a bigger scrap allotment. It was about accessing the power the hegemony hoarded. Kalen focused on the environmental readouts within the Viridian hull. The internal temperature was dropping too fast. The energy shunt had bought him time, but it had also accelerated the core's depletion rate by stressing its remaining reserves. The Xylos ship was dying of loneliness, of inactivity. Suddenly, the proximity alarm blared, not the low, anxious tone of his ship's system, but a sharp, authoritative military ping. Ethel signature. Not a drone, but a manned interceptor, small, fast, and closing rapidly from the outer rim patrols. Designation: Vindicator. Class security cutter. Lyra. They're not sending drones. They sent a fast response unit. They know the precise coordinates. Someone flagged my initial sensor ping before I even established comms with you. Lyra cursed, a sharp, unintelligible word in the old tongue. The tracking software on the probe must have left a residual trace on the main network before you encrypted the uplink. Kalen, abort. You have a target lock on your stern. You cannot outrun a Vindicator in this field. The Vindicator showed on his tactical display, a dart of sharp, angular metal slicing through the debris field with arrogant ease, its primary weapon banks cycling power. It wasn't there for salvage or warning. It was there for termination and scrubbing. Kalen gripped the controls, the chill in the cockpit now bone deep. He had seconds to choose: run and condemn the Viridian ship, or engage in a fight he could not win, but which might buy the necessary delay. He looked at the data packet indicator. Upload complete. The anonymous whisper was launched. He did not turn the rust bucket to flee. Instead, he executed a tight, desperate maneuver, banking sharply into the dense core of the debris field, aiming not away from the Vindicator, but directly toward the colossal, shattered remains of the ring station he had passed earlier. I'm taking the long way out, Lyra, Kalen said, his voice steadying as the sheer impossibility of the situation clarified his mind. Tell Rowan Kestrel to prepare for a system-wide quarantine alert. Tell him the price of curiosity just went up. He armed the single, obsolete magnetic pulse emitter he kept hidden in the underbelly, a tool designed only to momentarily disable small mining drones, never a hegemony military vessel. He accelerated toward the wreckage, praying that the density of the metal graveyard and the sheer mass of the broken station would shroud his thermal bloom just long enough for the Vindicator to commit to a pursuit vector that would either destroy it or leave him with a fighting chance. The fight was no longer about preservation. It was about creating enough chaos for the truth to escape. The smell of burnt insulation was so thick, Kalen could taste the pulverized carbon coating the back of his throat, a flavor infinitely worse than the nutrient paste he had failed to consume. He didn't wait for Lyra's reply. The connection snapped as he threw the main drive past 80% capacity, the aged conduits groaning in protest. The Vindicator was closing the distance with the ruthless efficiency of a precision tool designed for demolition. It wasn't maneuvering through the wreckage, it was carving a path, using low-yield kinetic bursts to shunt aside obstacles that would have shredded the rust bucket. Kalen fought the controls, wrestling the salvaged hull into a tight yaw, forcing the ship to hug the shadow line of a massive dead fusion core, a derelict structure easily the size of a small moon, its surface layered with centuries of crystallized radiation residue. He activated the magnetic pulse emitter, not toward the Vindicator, but directly beneath his own stern. The resulting surge of localized electromagnetic distortion was designed to confuse tracking systems, not disable them. For a glorious, heart-stopping second, the targeting reticule on the Vindicator wavered, its firing solution momentarily corrupted by the massive inert magnetic field of the core structure. It was the opening he needed. Kalen hammered the maneuvering thrusters, diving the rust bucket into the decaying structure's main equatorial fracture. The external sensors shrieked in alarm as micrometeoroids, normally harmlessly deflected, began to impact the hull with the force of high-caliber slugs. Each impact sent a spike of physical shock up through the deck plating and into his worn command seat. He felt the familiar grinding pain radiate from his shoulder. A chronic injury from a salvage operation near the Molvrek border, now reignited by the sheer stress on his frame. He needed to buy time to execute a controlled field collapse, a localized distortion that would render the entire area impassable to anything larger than a light scout for at least 3 cycles, hopefully long enough for the Ethel response fleet to arrive and find only debris and silence where the Vindicator had been. He reached the primary control nexus for the magnetic pulse emitter, now running at 105% capacity due to the previous overload. The casing was hot enough to fuse flesh. He ignored the heat shimmer distorting his vision and began rerouting the power from the failing main stabilizers directly into the emitter's capacitor bank. This was a catastrophic choice. Without stable stabilizers, the rust bucket would become a tumbling wreck in the slightest gravitational eddy, but stability was irrelevant if they were vaporized first. Lyra, I'm collapsing the field now. Get ready to punch a blind jump corridor on the far side of the wreck. I need coordinates fed to me manually. My nav system is slag. There was a beat of static, then Lyra's voice, laced with raw exertion. Kalen, I can't guarantee precision. The local network is collapsing under the hegemony's immediate lockdown protocols. They are throttling all non-essential traffic. I can feed you an estimated vector, a high-probability safe zone. But if you miss the window, you'll end up in a stellar nursery or deep core. Give me the vector. Kalen ground out, his jaw muscles tight. He could feel the heat searing through his glove, a deep radiating burn spreading across his palm. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let go of the controls. Saving the Xylo's legacy meant enduring the physical destruction of his own vessel, of his own body. As he locked the final reroute, the internal atmosphere controls sputtered and died. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of superheated metal and the recycled scent of his own panic. He watched the power level on the emitter spike dangerously high, past the point of containment, pushing toward detonation. Then, the Vindicator reappeared. It had not been fooled by the magnetic shimmer. It had used the brief chaos to execute a highly precise microburn, flanking Kalen's position by slipping through a narrow gorge in the wreckage that the rust bucket, bulkier and older, could never navigate safely. The hegemony cutter positioned itself less than 500 meters away, directly between Kalen and the Viridian seed ship. It was a declaration of intent. The target was the interloper, not the anomaly. A harsh, synthesized voice boomed over the external comms, overriding the static, a voice of pure, unimpressed authority, stripped of warmth or hesitation. Salvage vessel, rust bucket, cease all propulsion and eject power core access keys. Failure to comply within 10 standard seconds will result in immediate structural disintegration. This is Hegemony Security Directive Gamma 97. 10 seconds. Kalen looked at the emitter, fully charged, seconds from achieving the necessary charge for a localized collapse, but still needing to lock onto the Vindicator's power signature to effectively shunt the burst back at the pursuer. If he engaged the emitter now, he might shatter the Vindicator, but the resulting energy feedback would cook his own remaining systems and likely render the rust bucket an unpiloted hulk drifting toward the Viridian ship, which would then be easily recovered by the inevitable sweep fleet. If he tried to run, the Vindicator would vaporize him before he cleared the structural shadow. He made the assessment. He could not afford to fight. He could only afford to disappear. He slammed his fist down on the targeting sequence override, bypassing the magnetic pulse emitter entirely. He switched the entire remaining power reserve, life support, comms, main drive, into a desperate one-time use maneuver. A controlled microgravity inversion pulse. designed to momentarily flip the gravitational polarity within the immediate area, throwing anything not structurally anchored into chaos. It was a wild, untested tactic derived from obscure anti-gravity schematics Lyra had once smuggled to him. The Vindicator was armed and ready. It fired. The energy beam lanced out, a blinding spear of focused plasma aimed precisely at the rust bucket's central mass. Kalen felt the impact not as a sound, but as a sudden, agonizing spike of intense heat across his shields that instantly plummeted to less than 5% integrity. A secondary rupture tore through the starboard flank of the cockpit, and a heavy metal brace, a piece of old engine casing he'd never bothered to replace, was ripped from its mounts by the inertia shift and slammed into Kalen's lower ribs. He gagged, a searing, breath-stealing pain exploding through his torso, forcing the air from his lungs in a strangled gasp. But the inversion pulse hit the Vindicator simultaneously. The hegemony cutter, reliant on precisely calibrated inertial dampeners, bucked violently. Its pilot was thrown against restraints, the controlled pursuit vector dissolving into a chaotic tumble as external mass suddenly sought to repel its center of gravity. Kalen felt his own body pressed violently against the restraints, his internal organs seemingly trying to relocate themselves. He fought through the pain, forcing his vision clear enough to see the tactical display flicker wildly. The Vindicator was spinning, its position corrupted, momentarily neutralized. "Vector! Lyra! Now!" he wheezed, tasting bile and iron. Lyra's voice was thin, distorted by the failing transmission relays. "Vector locked. Exiting to the edge of the Xylos influence zone, Kalen. Brace for gravitational shearing." Kalen shoved the controls forward, pouring the last dregs of energy into the main drive, aiming for the empty coordinates Lyra provided. The rust bucket lunged out of the shadow of the derelict core, leaving behind the spinning, disabled Vindicator and the silent, brooding Viridian seed ship. The transition was not a jump, it was a tearing. The ship screamed as it passed through the boundary layer, the gravitational shearing acting like a cosmic vice grip. Kalen felt the hull plating buckle audibly. The pain in his ribs intensified, a sharp, stabbing agony that made him black out for agonizing microseconds at a time. When the violent shaking finally subsided, the view outside was starkly different. No debris field, no colossal husks. Only the cold, unending vista of intergalactic void, punctuated by the distant, indifferent light of unconcerned stars. The rust bucket was crippled, barely holding atmosphere, the air thick with the scent of scorched circuitry, and Kalen's own weakening blood. He managed to cycle the life support to emergency reserve, a meager 20 hours of thin, recycled air. The comms were dead, the main screen fractured into a spiderweb of dark glass. He was alive, technically, but isolated, wounded, and adrift in an empty sector. Then, a new reading flashed on the single remaining auxiliary diagnostic monitor, ignoring the severe damage to the primary systems. It wasn't a warning ping, or a threat. It was a beacon, impossibly strong, emanating from the direction he had just fled, the direction of Verlassung. It was the Viridian ship. The stabilization he had forced, combined with the chaos of the fighting, had triggered an unexpected reaction. The Xylos vessel was not merely surviving, it was activating. A slow, methodical energy pulse, exponentially stronger than the initial hum, was now broadcasting across the entire sector band. A clear, structured communication, not just a faint data whisper. It was a request, or perhaps a command, for assistance. And the beacon was locked onto the rust bucket's fading emergency transponder. Kalen had not just saved a few samples, he had awoken something colossal. And whatever had just been awakened knew exactly where to find the only other sentient life form it had interacted with. He was no longer running from the hegemony. He was being summoned by a ghost vast enough to rewrite galactic history, and he was too damaged to refuse the call. The emergency light on the auxiliary monitor cast long, skeletal shadows across the cracked plastic of Kalen's navigation console. The air, thin and metallic, tasted stale, the artificial humidity having failed completely. He forced his eyes away from the repeating beacon signal, a vast, emerald waveform that dwarfed the faint flickering output of his own distress beacon, and instead focused on the damage report scrolling beneath it. The internal pressure compensators were gone. He was operating in a rapidly degrading envelope, held together by sheer luck and the stubborn integrity of the original Xylo's docking seal. The summoned signal was not random noise. It was a directed broadcast, a beam of perfect coherence piercing the residual distortions of the microgravity pulse. It was targeting him, not as a threat, but as a destination. He had given the ancient archive a focal point, a key to the lock, and now the lock was swinging open. Kalen knew with a certainty that settled colder than the vacuum outside that the hegemony would find the Vindicator crippled, and they would trace the distortion pattern back to its source, the Viridian vessel. But if the seed ship was now actively broadcasting, it was no longer inert scrap. It was an object of supreme strategic value, and the hegemony would dispatch overwhelming force, not just security cutters, but entire task groups equipped for sterilization. His ribs screamed with every shallow breath he dragged from the failing recycling unit. He had to see what the beacon meant, what purpose the Xylo's ship now sought. His survival hinged on understanding the command he had unwittingly accepted. With agonizing slowness, he managed to activate the emergency backup optical relay, a tiny insect eye camera mounted externally near the bow, designed only for docking maneuvers. He routed its feed to the auxiliary screen. The view was grainy, distant, but horrifyingly clear. The Viridian ship was no longer dark. The emerald runes were blazing, pulsing in time with the broadcast. But the focus of the activity was not the entrance he had used. A massive aperture, previously invisible, was unfolding on the ship's equator, a maw of swirling, structured darkness. It wasn't designed for docking. It was designed for ingress on a scale that suggested swallowing entire fleets. And something was coming out. It was not a starship. It was a vast, slow-moving lattice of crystalline material, larger than the rust bucket, moving with the terrible, deliberate grace of something obeying fundamental universal laws rather than propulsion mechanics. It approached the crippled Vindicator, the hegemony ship Kalen had left spinning. Kalen watched, paralyzed by the cold realization dawning in his gut. He had assumed the Ethel were the primary threat, the jailers holding back humanity. He had focused on disrupting their localized control. But the Xylo ship wasn't just a seed vault, it was a contingency. And the Vindicator was collateral damage in its awakening sequence. The lattice reached the hegemony cutter. There was no explosion, no energy discharge. The crystalline structure simply enveloped the Vindicator. Kalen watched the angular, aggressive lines of the Ethel warship slowly, systematically dissolve. It didn't burn or shatter. It seemed to be unmade at the molecular level, its matter absorbed into the larger, complex structure of the lattice. The hegemony's symbol of oppressive technological superiority was being recycled into raw material. This was the secret Lyra had only glimpsed. The Xylos were not merely preservers, they were restorers. They reclaimed entropy. And the hegemony's vast, centralized control apparatus, their political domination, their rigid adherence to specific technological pathways, was to the Xylos nothing more than inefficient structure awaiting dissolution. Humanity's chains were made of flawed, easily disassembled materials. The lattice, now slightly larger and subtly changed in its composition, perhaps incorporating the hegemony metallurgy, began moving toward Kalen's faint signal. The realization struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow. Saving the Xylo's archive required the dismantling of the dominant galactic power structure. This was not a limited war. This was a complete systemic reset, initiated by an entity that viewed all manufactured order as temporary waste. If he aligned himself with this power, humanity might be elevated, preserved, perhaps even seeded across the cosmos as the Xylos intended. But the price was the absolute erasure of the existing galactic order, the order that, however oppressive, currently kept pockets of human civilization barely functioning. The choice solidified: protect the remnants of human sovereignty, however flawed, or trade one set of masters for a silent, overwhelming evolutionary force. He had to warn someone, anyone. He had to relay the true nature of the threat, or the opportunity, before he was assimilated. He slammed his fist against the dead comm panel again, trying to force a flicker of power, anything to get a single desperate burst out to Lyra. Nothing. The primary capacitors were fried. Kalen looked at the schematic for his primary drive core. It was a Frankenstein's monster of patched-together components, but the main reactor, a heavily shielded, barely functional fusion cell, still possessed a residual charge sufficient for a single, massive energy discharge. It was the last power reserve he had, meant only for life support extension. He wouldn't transmit data. He would transmit a catastrophic failure, a false flag. If he overloaded the core violently, the resulting energy signature would appear to the hegemony's distant sensors as the rust bucket finally succumbing to its injuries, vaporizing in deep space. It would buy Lyra and Rowan Kestrel precious cycles to move their clandestine operations before the hegemony arrived to sweep the sector clean of the first disruption. It would mean a swift, agonizing death for Kalen, alone in the dark. But it would be an act of agency, choosing the manner of his end rather than submitting to assimilation or hegemony reprisal. He began the manual bypass sequence, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs, forcing his numb fingers to complete the complex. Precise physical inputs required to shunt the reserve power directly into the magnetic containment fields. He was choosing the known difficult struggle of humanity over the terrifying sterile perfection of the Xylos. It was a deeply flawed, profoundly human choice born of loyalty to the imperfect present. The energy level monitor on the drive flickered green, then deep amber. He was seconds from critical overload. Just as the gauge hit the critical threshold, the auxiliary screen flashed violently, the beacon signal replaced by a new, urgent data overlay. It was Lyra. She had managed to reroute a single, weak burst through a decaying long-range relay. Her face was not pale now. It was grim, etched with absolute despair. Kalen, they found the data packet, the Moss sequences. They traced the anonymous routing signature back to the coordinates of the power spike, Verlassung 3. But that is not the critical data. The hegemony didn't just find the trace, they analyzed the transmitted genetic sequences before they clamped the network. She paused, drawing a ragged breath that crackled over the ruined channel. Kalen, the Moss, it's not just extinct flora, it's a biomechanical lock. The Xylos didn't just archive life, they archived the specific genetic markers required to interact with their containment fields. The hegemony realized what you did. You gave the Viridian ship the key to its own activation, and they know it's linked to the primary drive. They didn't send the Vindicator to stop you. They sent it to acquire you alive, or at least the remains of your navigational core, believing you hold the final sequence. Kalen stared, the core overload sequence halfway complete. The hegemony wasn't trying to contain the Xylos ship. They were trying to co-opt the mechanism Kalen had inadvertently triggered. They weren't afraid of the Xylos. They wanted to pilot them. Before Kalen could react, the crystalline lattice outside, the Xylos recovery unit, erupted in a blinding flash of emerald light. It had detected the massive, self-destructive power surge building within the rust bucket's core. The Xylos perceived his final act of self-sacrifice as a threat to their revived system, a chaotic energy spike that needed immediate suppression. The lattice did not attempt to assimilate the rust bucket. It enveloped the small vessel entirely, sealing Kalen and his failing reactor inside a perfectly smooth, dark crystalline shell, severing all external contact and trapping the surging power inside. The final sound Kalen registered was not the scream of his overloaded drive, but the terrifying, soft thud of the containment field slamming shut, locking him inside a perfectly preserved yet accelerating coffin aimed directly toward the ancient awakening cathedral of the Xylos. He was no longer a casualty. He was their only known, living interface, and his demise was being professionally averted. The crushing weight settled not just on the hull, but on Kalen's awareness, a sudden, profound cessation of effort. The searing pain in his ribs, the blinding urgency of self-destruction, vanished, replaced by the absolute, crushing finality of external control. He was encased. The crystalline material was not a prison. It was a perfect, non-reactive sealant, isolating his failing life support system, smothering the overloaded reactor before it could achieve critical mass. His final desperate act of defiance had been neutralized before it could even complete its chemical reaction. When Kalen forced his eyes open, the auxiliary screen had gone black, then flickered back to a single dominant image. The emerald beacon signal, now overwhelming his own failing distress pulse. He was being towed, or perhaps carried, by the lattice structure, moving with terrifying, effortless speed back toward the source of the signal, the Xylos arc. The viewport, previously showing the indifferent void, was now filled entirely by the massive, seamless geometry of the crystalline entity that held him captive. It was pulling him toward that unfolding abyssal maw on the side of the seed ship. He tried to move his hands. They responded sluggishly, weighted by the residual adrenaline dump and the internal trauma of the gravity shearing. He tested the external comms again, an instinctive reflex. Silence. The crystalline shell was not merely armor, it was a complete Faraday cage, tuned precisely to negate any outgoing signal while allowing the internal, emerald resonance to pass through unhindered. He was disconnected, unplugged from the known universe, and being delivered to the very power he had tried, futilely, to destroy for the sake of humanity's chaotic freedom. The silence inside the shell was different from the prior vacuum. It was an oppressive, active silence, the sound of absolute efficiency. He could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of his own failing environmental regulators, and beneath that, the deep, continuous vibration of the lattice moving, vibrating at a frequency that seemed designed to soothe or sedate its contents. He thought of Lyra, scrambling on the edge of system collapse, believing she had sent him a final warning, only to have Kalen deliberately incinerate himself moments later. He imagined Rowan Kestrel, waiting for the ghost of a catastrophic explosion that would never come, instead finding only dead air, assuming Kalen had simply been vaporized by the Vindicator before the hegemony cleanup crews arrived. He had failed them all. His desire to preserve humanity's imperfect autonomy had resulted in his immediate neutralization and delivery to the very force that sought to impose a perfect, alien order. The weight of this defeat was physical, a deep, throbbing ache that settled behind his sternum, far worse than the broken ribs. It wasn't the failure of the plan that crushed him. It was the realization that his species, humanity, was fundamentally incapable of operating on a scale that mattered. When confronted with true, foundational power, the power that erased stars or preserved entire epochs, humanity was reduced to a brief, noisy disturbance, a misplaced power fluctuation that needed to be corrected by the maintenance crew. His desperate, flawed choice to protect the present over gambling on an alien future was not noble. It was merely sentimental. The lattice began to slow its approach to the aperture. Kalen's heart rate, already elevated from exertion and injury, began to spike in a purely physiological response to dread. He was being delivered. As the shell neared the swirling darkness of the Xylos entryway, the emerald light intensified. For a split second, the visual feed from the external camera cleared, allowing Kalen a terrifyingly close look at the unfolding structure. He realized the aperture was not simply a hole, it was a focusing lens, generating a structured field that negated the inertia of everything entering it. Then, the lattice halted. It did not complete the insertion. The exterior crystal shell surrounding the rust bucket vibrated, not with the soothing hum of transport, but with a sharp, resonant spike, a question transmitted through vibration rather than light or sound. The lattice pulled back fractionally, hovering just outside the threshold of the aperture. The hegemony. A second massive energy reading bloomed on the auxiliary display, overriding the Xylos beacon momentarily. It was a fleet signature, arriving with the expected speed of a hegemony sterilization effort after the Vindicator failed to report in. They were not sending drones this time. They were deploying heavy strategic assets, their vessels blotting out the distant starlight. The Xylos entity, for all its power to dissolve matter, seemed unwilling to engage a large, organized military force directly at the threshold of its core structure. The hegemony hadn't just sent troops. They had sent data analysts who understood the threat profile of an awakening progenitor race. They were waiting for the Xylos to commit further, to reveal their true capabilities before launching an overwhelming saturation strike. Kalen was trapped between two immovable forces. The Xylos held him hostage, using him as a potential key while unwilling to expose their primary structure to organized attack. The hegemony had arrived to quarantine the entire phenomenon, viewing both the Xylos ship and Kalen as contaminated variables requiring immediate erasure. He was sitting inside the epicenter of a galactic confrontation, an object of equal value to both sides, yet utterly powerless to influence either. He was the bait in a trap that had only just been sprung. He forced himself to analyze the situation, ignoring the throbbing pain that made him nauseous. The hegemony blockade was forming a defensive perimeter, concentrating fire on the Viridian hull's outer shell, testing its durability. They would not advance until they had a complete tactical picture. The Xylos entity, guarding the entrance, was clearly prioritized defense over assimilation. Kalen remembered the moss, the biomechanical lock. The hegemony needed him to unlock the core, but the Xylos entity was preventing him from getting close enough to be utilized. He searched the remaining operational schematics of the rust bucket, ignoring the flashing red warnings about hull breaches and near-zero life support. He found a single, obscure subsystem, the low-yield, wide-spectrum emergency beacon used for signaling debris field recovery crews, a signal so weak it was usually filtered out by background static. It was the antithesis of the Xylos' perfect, coherent broadcast. It was noise. If he could engage that beacon and overload its emitter while the external shell was active, the resulting electromagnetic chaos might do one of two things: either disrupt the Xylos entity's hyper-focused concentration, or more likely, momentarily overload the hegemony's sophisticated targeting arrays, which were focused on neutralizing the massive, clean Xylos signal. It was a suicidal gamble based on generating interference, a primal, messy human tactic against cosmic order. He had nothing left to lose but the tiny, contained atmosphere within his crystalline shell. If the hegemony saw a second, localized energy source, they would prioritize its destruction, viewing it as a secondary threat attempting to escape the quarantine zone. That secondary attack might damage the Xylos shell enough to grant him an opening. His broken ribs protested savagely as he forced his body to twist toward the emergency access panel, the one part of the console he hadn't deliberately destroyed. He ripped the panel cover off with a cry of pure physical agony, exposing the brittle, dust-covered wiring beneath. The air inside the shell felt thinner, colder, as if the crystalline material was siphoning off the last vestiges of heat. He bypassed the safety interlocks for the emergency beacon, routing the remaining power from the crippled environmental controls directly into the emitter. The monitor flashed a single terrifying warning: integrity compromised. Systemic shutdown imminent. Kalen didn't hesitate. He slammed his palm onto the activation rune etched crudely into the bypass circuit he had fashioned days ago. A hideous, ugly spike of disorganized static, a sound like tearing metal broadcast across all frequencies, erupted from his failing vessel, screaming defiance into the heart of the hegemony blockade and the silent sentinel of the Xylos. The reaction was instantaneous. The external emerald light of the Xylos lattice shifted violently from steady transport vibration to a furious defensive pulse, aimed directly at the source of the chaotic disruption. The crystalline shell around the rust bucket began to vibrate with a new, focused intensity. Not the gentle tug of transport, but the violent, shearing whine of imminent structural failure. He had achieved visibility, but only as a contaminant slated for immediate cleansing. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The shriek of uncontrolled energy ripped through the crystal cocoon. It was not the sophisticated, resonant hum of the Xylos matrix. It was the raw, uncontrolled noise of human desperation, raw electromagnetic pollution vomiting into the finely tuned field. Kalen felt the internal structure of the rust bucket groan in protest, the remaining auxiliary power conduits flashing white-hot as they dumped their final reserves into the emergency emitter, pushing the signal far beyond its design tolerances. The hegemony response was faster than Kalen could have predicted. a testament to their automated threat assessment protocols. Targeting beams, thin as razor wire but carrying the compressed energy of tactical destroyers, instantly snapped onto the source of the noise, the containment field holding Kalen. The Xylos entity reacted with a defensive reflex that transcended calculation. The emerald light flared into blinding turquoise, and the entity shifted its massive bulk, using the crystalline shell containing Kalen's ship as a physical shield against the incoming focused particle streams. The shell absorbed the initial volley, but the kinetic stress was monumental. Kalen's vision tunneled. The pain returned, sharper now, not from broken bones, but from the pressure attempting to liquefy his internal structure. He knew the hegemony intended to use kinetic force sufficient to shatter the shell without breaching the Xylos matrix protecting the entrance. They were testing the entity's resolve, sacrificing a localized threat, him, to gauge the enemy's defensive limitations. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper, a familiar failure to suppress the reflexive biology. The emergency broadcast continued its screaming static into the void. The hegemony, dedicated to absolute order, could not tolerate the chaos radiating from his tiny ship. They had to silence the noise. A secondary wave of targeting locked on, this time wider, designed not to penetrate but to shear off the entire outer layer of the containment field. The crystal groaned, a sound that scraped across Kalen's auditory sensors even through the insulation. He had bought milliseconds, perhaps a second, of hegemony hesitation, but the price was about to be collected in full. Then, the Xylos entity moved. It did not simply absorb the blast. It channeled the focused energy away from Kalen's immediate vicinity. Massive, unseen actuators within the progenitor ship adjusted the magnetic focusing lens of the aperture, creating a momentary, localized siphon effect designed to pull the disruptive energy signature, Kalen's noise, into the core structure for analysis and neutralization. This was the moment. The sudden, violent redirection of energy field topology caused a momentary cascade failure in the containment shell. The perfectly sealed crystal cracked, spiderwebbing outward from the rust bucket's hull. A jet of supercooled vacuum, the absolute zero of the debris field, rushed in, instantly flash-freezing the exposed wiring and sparking consoles. The overloaded emitter overloaded, spitting a final, weak arc of light before dissolving into slag. The noise stopped. Silence slammed back into the cockpit, heavier and more final than before. Kalen was still alive, the crystalline sealant holding enough atmosphere to keep him from immediate suffocation, but the structural integrity of his prison was gone. He was venting atmosphere slowly into the Xylos field, a trickle of human effluence into alien sanctity. The turquoise light faded back to the deep, steady emerald. The hegemony fleet, having neutralized the external noise and seeing the Xylos entity withdraw its defensive posture, began its deliberate advance toward the perimeter. They saw Kalen not as a survivor, but as the source of the anomaly that had been neutralized, a piece of junk to be ignored or incinerated once the larger prize was secured. The Xylos lattice, however, did not release him. It resumed its slow, inexorable transit toward the aperture, treating the temporary breach as a minor cleaning event rather than a strategic defeat. They still intended to process him, to absorb the data of his desperate action. Kalen dragged himself across the deck plating toward the main maneuvering console, ignoring the searing agony in his side. The external visual feed was intermittent, flickering through bursts of static as the shell continued to strain under external hegemony scrutiny. He saw the grim, familiar shapes of hegemony assault frigates, their gun batteries cycling into firing positions. He needed to move not toward the hegemony, but away from the path of the Xylos entity, which was now drawing him inexorably into its core. He accessed the manual override for the manipulator arm, the one that had been stopped dead by the initial barrier days ago. The arm was still clamped against the outside of the crystalline shell, frozen mid-reach. With trembling, numb fingers, he activated the independent hydraulics for the arm, rerouting the last sliver of power from the navigation systems. The motor whined, a sound almost identical to the death scream of his emergency beacon, a sound of pure, uncontrolled overload. The arm wrenched itself free from the crystal surface. The crystal, having absorbed external hegemony fire and now subjected to internal. Violent kinetic stress fractured further. A spiderweb of fissures raced across the shell surrounding the rust bucket. Kalen felt the ship lurch as the grip of the lattice momentarily faltered, distracted by the structural failure directly adjacent to its core entry point. It was a brutal, agonizing escape, utilizing the hegemony's desire to destroy him and the Xylo's need to contain him as leverage against each other. He wrestled the failing thrusters into life, burning the last of the highly volatile reaction mass stored for emergency vector correction. The rust bucket shot away from the lattice, tumbling end over end, a broken piece of scrap hurled back into the debris field. The flight was short and utterly uncontrolled. The momentum carried him hundreds of kilometers away from the Xylo's entity, tumbling him past the skeletal remains of an old Jovian cruiser until the final sputtering engine died. He drifted, silent again, bathed only in the weak reflected light of distant, uncaring stars. Kalen forced his face against the viewport. He had escaped capture, but his ship was dead in the water, crippled beyond repair. The reactor core was slag, the environmental controls offline, the navigational matrix reduced to flickering error codes. He was in a high radiation zone of the scrap field, his only atmosphere recycled bilge air tainted with ozone and his own fear. He activated the internal comms one last time, focusing on the frequency Lyra maintained for absolute emergencies, the one she used for transferring data on suspected hegemony infiltration. "Lyra!" Kalen gasped, the word catching in his throat as a spasm of internal pain racked his frame. "I am. Outside the active zone. The Xylos. They are real. They are preserving life. The hegemony is here. Containment underway." His voice was raw, stripped of all inflection. He waited, knowing the response would be delayed, perhaps never come. He had achieved nothing tangible for humanity, no grand leverage, only his own survival inside a dead coffin floating in cosmic refuse. He had disrupted the hegemony's data gathering, forced the Xylos to reveal a defensive threshold, but the grand secret remained locked away. As he watched the hegemony fleet begin its deliberate bombardment of the Xylos mass, a rain of energy that would sterilize this sector for centuries, Kalen stared at the console. The faint intermittent signal from the emergency beacon, the chaotic static that had bought him freedom, was attempting to transmit again. A ghost trying to speak from the ruined wiring. It was transmitting data. Not the Xylos archive, but the schematics of the rust bucket itself. Its obsolete life support tolerances, its jury-rigged power routing, the specific sequence used to overload the emitter. The hegemony was not interested in salvage. They hunted secrets. And Kalen, in his final act of noise, had broadcast the blueprints of his own survival. The low-tech, messy ingenuity that allowed a human to survive where perfect alien technology failed, directly into the open channels, a final, flawed data package suggesting that the true danger to their hegemony was not cosmic power, but human improvisation. He closed his eyes, the sound of distant, silent explosions echoing in the space where his ship's alarms used to scream. He had traded preservation for a whisper of defiance, and now he had nothing left to breathe but the fallout. The final dying surge of auxiliary power sputtered out. The frantic high-pitched whine of the emergency systems transitioned into a low, electronic flatline, a sound far more absolute than any explosion. Kalen hung suspended in the webbing of his command chair, his body a canvas of micro-traumas. He was adrift. The silence that replaced the din of battle was not peaceful. It was the sound of a vacuum reclaiming volume, the cessation of all meaningful interaction. He cycled the primary life support override, bypassing the fried reactor pathways. The air recyclers coughed once, grinding rusty gears, and then settled into a predictable, rhythmic drone, the sound of recycled breath, stale and smelling faintly of burnt insulation and old sweat. The air scrubbers, salvaged years ago from a defunct mining drone, could keep him functional for perhaps 72 standard hours, provided the filtration medium did not completely disintegrate. It was enough time to wait for either rescue, unlikely, given his unauthorized trajectory, or termination. Kalen carefully detached the medical sensors from his chest plating. The internal telemetry displayed a grim accounting. 3 fractured ribs, severe thermal stress to the right lung lobe, and persistent neurological feedback loops indicative of extreme sensory overload. He had survived the tactical calculus of the hegemony and the metaphysical defense of the Xylos, but he had done so by utilizing the precise technical frailties of both systems against one another. He was a creature of entropy, capitalizing on perfect order. He forced his gaze toward the viewport. Beyond the scarred polycarbonate, the sector was quieter now. The hegemony bombardment of the Xylos mass had ceased. The remnants of the ancient vessel were either vaporized, neutralized, or, more disturbingly, absorbed into whatever deeper defense layers the Xylos possessed. There were no lingering energy signatures, no debris plumes, just the slow, patient drift of inert wreckage, the ghosts of millennia. The hegemony would log this sector as stabilized, the anomaly neutralized, and move on, satisfied that their technological hegemony remained unchallenged. Kalen had not brought back a starship or a technology capable of overthrowing the hegemony. He had brought back knowledge, fragmented and poisonous, packaged in a suicide broadcast, detailing how a near-obsolete salvage vessel could disrupt layered defenses using nothing more than poorly maintained capacitors and desperate timing. The hegemony, paranoid about internal subversion, would undoubtedly track that flawed schematic back to its origin point, the human sectors designated for low-priority service. Rowan Kestrel, the presumed pilot who had died in the static storm, would be vaporized in the after-action report, but the method of his survival would become a new, highly sensitive threat vector, forcing a tightening of protocol compliance across all supervised species. He had created a political consequence, not a military revolution. He managed to haul himself into the pilot's seat, the heavy metal frame groaning under his weight. The navigation matrix was almost entirely dark, save for the faint, unreliable glow of the emergency beacon's local relay, the signal that had broadcast his suicide note. He isolated the module, recognizing the futility of broadcasting further. Lyra, if she had received the data packet of the preserved flora, would now be deep in quarantine, her laboratory likely swept clean by hegemony technical teams within the next cycle. She was collateral, a necessary sacrifice for the dissemination of truth. He thought of Eris Northwick, the engineer who saw limitation as imposition. She had paid for her insight with forced re-education. Kalen had paid with the functional remnants of his life, trading his ship, his certainty, and his future trajectory for the brief, undeniable proof that humanity's potential was actively being suppressed. The price was steep, the gain intangible. He brought up the sensor log from the moments before the final engine burnout. There was no record of the Xylos entity noticing him after the crystal fractured. It had simply reverted to its primary function, containment and preservation, treating the explosive expulsion of the rust bucket as the removal of a contaminant particle. They had not seen a threat. They had merely jettisoned waste. That final assessment, that he was less significant than a biological fouling agent, settled over him with a cold finality. Kalen reached out, his fingers numb, tracing the outline of the viewport. The last memory of the internal Xylos environment, the green, living light, the scent of preserved oceans, was already fading, overwritten by the harsh stink of ozone and failing machinery. He was back in the scrapyard, not among the wreckage of the ancients, but within the wreckage of his own endeavor. The hegemony would eventually find this dead husk, assuming they bothered to look past the Xylos bombardment zone. When they did, they would find only dust, a few inert biological signatures in the air recycler filters, and a pilot who had run out of maneuvering fuel. He looked down at his hand, the same hand that had trembled 5 years prior when he decided to follow Eris's dangerous theories. Now, the skin was tough, scarred by radiation burns and the constant friction of metal dust. It was the hand of a scavenger who had briefly touched a sublime secret and been permitted to keep only the weight of that memory. He remembered the metallic groan of the rust bucket's magnetic grapples fighting for purchase against the fused engine blocks on his very first arrival here, the sound that heralded intrusion into forbidden space. That sound was gone now, replaced by the quiet sigh of his own failing atmosphere. The metallic groan of the rust bucket's magnetic grapples fighting for purchase against a superstructure of fused, derelict engine blocks was the loudest sound in the sector. He closed his eyes, the faint, sweet scent of ionized metal stinging his nostrils one last time, a final physical reminder of the threshold crossed and the impossibility of return. There was nothing left to salvage in the void now, only the long, inevitable drift toward equilibrium. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an, abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.